So welcome to Office Hours number 43. And let me just start by reintroducing Adam Mitchell.
Hello again.
Good to see you. And we're here to talk about your responses to our week on agribusiness and agriculture in China on the CP case. But first let me note the continuing good news that another 1,273 of you successfully received a certificate for ChinaX Part 9. And Professor Bold tells me that we have more learners completing certificates in our course than in any other Harvard X course.
That's what I hear.
Yeah? So thank you very much. And this last week was our very first case study. It is really an experiment to see how we can try to translate the excitement of what goes on in a case study classroom to video. And I think some of you thought it was really exciting to see a professor interacting directly with students, and others found it complicated. And I don't blame you, because it is, particularly if it depends on how much of the case you will have read, difficult to follow in every detail what's going on. It's much more difficult to film also. But we're going to do some more of them. We're going to do 3 of them all together. Some of you found the assessments distracting, and we've tried to improve on that in the coming case studies in coming weeks. And so I hope you'll bear with us, but please let us know what you think.
Yeah, and many students also asked, how can I download and print the case? Well, the answer is you can't.
Directly from us, you can't.
Right. However, you can purchase the case. These are available from Harvard Business School. We have access to allow our students to read them, but not to print them. And
so we've given you in this three free cases, as it were, but other cases than Harvard Business School Publishing.
Right.
You can go to their website.
And we'll put a link on the screen for that if you want to buy them.
Right. And they're not outrageous in price. And for the authors of these cases, I would urge you to buy them. So now we've got some interesting questions from learners. And let me just start with a few of these. Very good question, and then I'll ask Adam the first one. With the increasing mechanization of agriculture, fewer and fewer farmers are needed. What then is going to happen to the current 700 million farmers in China?
Well, they kind of answered it themselves in the question, fewer and fewer farmers are needed. I think the estimate is that China's target is that they want to have 10% of the population engaged in agriculture, which is reasonable right now. The figure is significantly higher than that. Those people will be moving to the cities and finding jobs in factories and other kinds of professions. As the population gets more and more educated, it'll open up more white-collar, middle-class work. That's the trend that we're seeing in China today.
And I would say that it's always been said so often that there are, it used to be said when I was a student, right up until the 1990s, that 80% of the Chinese population are farmers. And it would be true that 80% of them would be, up until that point in time, more or less, connected to the land, but earning an income only from farming, never 80%. And there were lots of sideline activities, small handicraft manufacturing, things of this sort. And
people deeply engaged with a large commercial economy.
And there's, historically in China as elsewhere, there's a great deal not of unemployment, but underemployment in what are seasonal activities. Now, are there limits to production on arable land? They are doing very intensive farming.
Well, we found some of those limits. We just talked about the Maoist era, for example, when they were doing close planting and deep plowing and things, trying to maximize in these Sputnik fields, you know, the absolute maximum. Of course, and those were total failures. So I think CP is a very good instance of how much you can actually grow in very small acreage in one mu of land, really maximizing the yield. So yeah, of course there are limits. That's why they're expanding the Hangzhou Bay. That's why they're opening up new land.
And it also has to do with, again, mechanization of sorts. If you look at agriculture in terms of livestock, in the facility, in the chicken facility in Cixi that we visited, there are 1 million chickens in that facility. They have, CP Group has another facility near Beijing that has 3 million chickens. Now, this is not something that you could have done 100 years ago,
right,
because those kind of facilities did not exist.
Right. So what we're seeing is, I think, a centralization of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
Larger farms
Right.
ran by
Right.
corporations rather than individual farmers, or they're hiring individual farmers to
Right.
help farm. So I think that's the trend that we're witnessing.
So one person asks, I don't understand the land ownership. The state owns the land, and yet farmers can lease it to others. And in this case, actually, it is the state that's leasing it to CP Group in the farm that we visited.
Mm-hmm.
Is that done solely at the farmer's risk? So land is owned in China by local governments,
Right.
But it is owned by the government. And there are provisions now in law by which farmers who have the right to till the land can lease it to others.
Yeah, it depends. It's a province-to-province basis how these laws are implemented.
It's a very complicated, but basically, China has gone from a society of multiple small landowners with real ownership rights to one in which the state now owns all the land since 1949, right up still to the present.
Another learner asked, how unique is the CP Group? How unique is the leadership? Do you find this kind of leadership in state-owned enterprises? And they also ask, is this intertwining of business and Confucian ethics common? Is that what they're doing?
You know, I think that intertwining is much more common in Chinese companies outside of China. It's becoming more common again in private companies within China, but much more common in overseas Chinese companies like the CP Group. But the leadership is quite different from that of a state-owned enterprise. Heads of state-owned enterprises tend to be rotated every few years to other state-owned enterprises or to other government positions. They are government bureaucrats. They can be extraordinary business leaders for periods of time, but they don't own the company. This is a family-based company in which the patriarch, Chairman Danin Chervanon, really is, it is his and his family's collective company. Others, of course, own it as well, those parts that are shareholding enterprises. But it has deep roots in family and has deep roots in Confucian traditions of patriarchy, of loyalty, of hard work, and of many modern traditions of how to run a modern business, how to be innovative, how to be scientific as well. But you'll see this. People like Chairman Danin. The question goes on to say, is he? How many Chairman Danins, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates can you have? And the answer is, of course, not very many.
Right.
This is one of the reasons we chose this case, because he's an extraordinary individual.
And do you think that intertwining, as the person said, of business and Confucian ethics gives them a comparative advantage over the SOEs?
I think it does, particularly because it builds on the strength of family ties, which are nevertheless, it's Confucian ethics in a very modern world. It's Confucian ethics with modern characteristics because they employ extraordinarily able non-family members, professional managers in every part of their business. Now, one question here, let me ask you this. Cooperative farming didn't work in Mao's Great Leap Forward and led to the famine. Why would it work now? So in some sense, these are quite different forms of cooperative farming.
Right.
One of them is actually really cooperative,
right.
which is what's going on now, and the other is forced cooperative. But what do you say to this? It's a very interesting, I hadn't really thought of that.
I hadn't made that comparison either. I hadn't thought of them as being the same, for sure. But perhaps they are comparable in some ways. Well, we've talked about the Maoist era. I just mentioned, deep plowing and close cropping. There's many reasons why the Great Leap Forward failed, not the least of which was the communization, the creation of collective mess halls, the deconstruction of incentives for farmers to produce.
And in that sense, of course, it was a land revolution in which the farmers lost the land.
Right.
And we have an agricultural revolution in CP and other companies in which the farmers actually maintain their control of the land. CP does not own the land.
Right. So I think in this case what we see is a co-opting of farmers. The CP Group is working with farmers to maximize production, to have them engage. These farmers, as we talked about, a lot of them are from Jiangsu. They're used to working these soil conditions and things like that. They're bringing in the experience of the farmers as well as their land.
Yep.
and they're working with the farmers. The cooperatives in the Maoist era were something quite different that was imposed upon the farmers, and they did not really like it for sure.
They hated it. They hated it. Will a foreign-owned company, one learner asks, will a foreign-owned company be especially targeted by the public in expressing its anger against the pollution caused by industrial farming? I think it's a great question, and certainly to my knowledge, there have not been these kind of accusations against CP as there have been against some other Chinese industrial farming efforts in China. My guess is also that there may be some political insulation of being an overseas Chinese company, not just a foreign company. They are a Thai company, without question, but they're also incorporated as a Chinese companies in every Chinese province, and they have a name that is pronounceable in Chinese, and they're ethnically and historically Chinese, even as Thai citizens.
Right. So what about animal rights? So one user comments that the chicken factories, they look sort of cruel, a little bit horrific. What would you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on animal rights and on comparative rearing of chickens, but what I do know is that these facilities have more room per chicken and better, safer, more healthy facilities for the chickens in those cages than most of their North American counterparts. And so it is state of the art. It's not free range, to be sure, but of this kind of farming, it's state of the art. And so the way it has been explained to me is that these chickens, while they are alive, are better treated than would be the norm in North American markets, let alone in many Chinese markets. Of course, it isn't.
So maybe it's not ideal, but it's not the first to be criticized.
It may not be a good time to be a chicken.
Yeah. One more question that's similar. What are the risks associated with food production in China? And is the hype about contamination and these, terrible products blown out of proportion in some sense in the media?
No, the risks are enormous. And I think this is why CP Group is in an advantageous position, because they have a reputation for quality and for the control. This is why it's important to have this vertical supply chain in which they control the sourcing from the feed, right? And so that they're not surprised in the way. We have another case which we're not teaching on the milk industry, Ely dairy industry, a reasonably well-run dairy, but nevertheless it too was hit badly by the milk scandal of several years ago, in which a number of babies died in China because of melamine putting into the milk in the supply chain, adding protein, or at least allegedly the thought was adding protein, but basically putting an additive to milk that turned out to be poisonous.
For which that company wasn't responsible, right?
No, the Sanlu and others were the ones more responsible.
Yeah.
The chairman of Ely had come to Harvard Business School just the year before when we first taught the Ely case, and he gave, and forgive me, students, if I've mentioned this before, but he gave every HBS student in our two quarts of Ely milk, and our students drank their milk, and they're all fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the risks are enormous with this rapidly growing food consumption and production in China for an increasingly wealthy urban and rural consumers, and the controls are very weak.
And I think though an argument can be made that companies like CP are sort of maybe not leading the effort, but definitely at the front of increasing the controls by bringing farmers together, by putting them in a system where it can monitor the quality of its products. I would think, well, I would know from experience, I've seen the practices in rural China sometimes of individual farmers. I would imagine that the controls under CP are much more strict than just allowing a lot of individual farmers to take their goods to market that they grew in their backyard.
Right. And so sadly, in almost every agricultural product that one can think of, there are great companies, and really extraordinary ones like CP, and there are terrible companies in China, and fraud and misrepresentation of products, what's in this sausage, how much of this wine that claims to be Chinese wine is really Chinese and how much is Chilean bulk.
Right.
All of this is rampant. And so one has to keep focusing on where is the high quality. And there are good reasons why discerning Chinese will drink X or Y milk, often international, or X or Y Chinese wine as opposed to Z and Q.
Right.
So now we have
a word cloud.
Other than food, our word cloud, what else was produced in China before 1949? So thinking of agricultural products and other products that would be produced. And so what do our comrades say?
Well, in very bold letters in the center, we have the answer silk.
Silk, right.
So silk is the most common one, but there's also cotton, tea, tobacco, opium. One that isn't very large here, but I think is very important, is porcelain.
Yes, yes. It's surprising that that's so small.
Right. As you said, China comes from China. So
Indeed, indeed. Medicinal herbs and plants, fiber, that is cotton, but other fibers as well, but vegetable and vegetable oil, a whole range of things. But silk, number one, is the most famous Chinese export, without question. But and of course, large internal consumption. Tea would have been an even more important, in that purely economic terms, export.
Yeah, I think the point of this is that China had a thriving commercial economy with many local actors engaged in national and international markets.
Right, right. Anyway, great and fun word cloud to look at. Now we have your comments and discussions on the question. Here's one of the questions was, what advice would you give Chairman Danin? What do you think are the big challenges facing CP? So what does EM11 say, Adam?
So EM11 raises three major points. He says, or she says, I would advise Chairman Danin as follows: keep high quality standards. And of course that's very important. We just talked about that. 2, keep up investment in innovation and research, R&D, right. And 3, corporate social responsibility. And I think these are 3 things that CP itself considers to be central to its future growth and future development strategy.
Yeah, I think that's right. Dave Rigg says, and this would be true, I suppose, of almost any company. He says the biggest threat may be complacency. That is, it's doing so well. The case mentions competitors such as Tyson's that are looking for opportunities to jump ahead. We've seen complacent companies in the United States be overtaken by competition. Mentions Apple and the iPhone, but now presumably thinking about how Samsung and others are doing well. Xiaomi,
yeah,
maybe, at least, especially in China. So that's a very good point. I would say that it's as far as I can tell, however, this is the least complacent big company that I know of. It's constantly on the move and constantly at the edge.
Right, and I think CP has made its goal to really transform agriculture in China. Much like Apple, wants to transform the technological landscape. CP truly does want to transform agriculture, and that's its central goal, rather than just to maximize the company, to make the company as big as possible.
Yeah. So what are the challenges then? We have one learner, Dave Pomerantz, says the greatest imperative is the need for CP to retain its political advantage. And the greatest risk on that front will be that 100% Chinese company, this is a good point, like Hope, gains the favor of the Chinese Communist Party and of provincial governments. For the same reason, he doesn't see Tyson and other foreign companies as a serious risk. I think that's a good point. And he says, so treat bureaucrats well, be a good Chinese citizen, avoid controversy.
I think those are great comments. And I think as long as CP does that, and as long as they continue to improve the living standards of their employees, the farmers, as long as they continue to keep up the quality of their product, then I think they're pretty fine.
Buno says, in order to have a long and better relationship in China, they should give back more to the people of China, pay attention to philanthropy. For example, establish a business school or an agricultural research center in top universities. So corporate social responsibility as philanthropy, particularly in the research area, is the recommendation.
So Tsu Seno, who gives us wonderful comments almost on a weekly basis.
Yes, yes.
Lays out another 4-point strategy for Chairman Deneen. This person says, stay with the current course in China, continue to diversify into other markets.
Right.
Good advice. In China itself, be prepared for multiple scenarios. For example, what would a nationalistic approach to the food industry be like? What if CCP was bypassed by local Chinese companies? A comment that was just made. Third, succession. So a lot of goodwill has been built because of Chairman Deneen himself. What happens when the company has to pass its leadership down the generations of the family owners?
This is a challenge for every family company. The
For
question
every
of
dynasty.
for every dynasty. In this case, Chairman Deneen is fortunate to have 3 extraordinarily able sons. But it is, of course, a challenge.
And the 4th comment is, in one of the exhibits of the HBS case study, the person noticed too much diversification investments. So maybe CP is reaching beyond its core a little bit.
It is, without question, it's diversification in a whole range of different areas. And many of our MBA students, when we teach this course, say, well, there's a danger always of getting too far away from your core competences. But they have been successful in many, many different forms of business. So I think David Chow, because our last contributor this week, and he says the challenges of the CP group are similar to the challenges of China in the future. Lowering the number of farmers is one thing, as the young all want to move to the big cities, and this is accompanied by a decrease in arable land. Sustainability and food safety, another big issue. The growing need and desire for organic food products, that's absolutely true. And transparency as to how these are produced at every single step will be what Chinese people in the future will demand. And not just Chinese, even here.
Right.
And there will be more and more competitors. The CC, and this is a very good point, CP Group came in at a time when China had just reopened its doors. And so there was a huge gap for what they could do and provide compared to others in China. The challenge will be to identify such gaps in the future and apply research and development to solve issues not yet identified to stay ahead of the game. So that, I think, is good advice to the chairman.
I think it's very astute.
And my guess is that he would agree with it. Well, thank you all very much, and we will see you next week.
Yes. Look forward to seeing you again.
All right. Bye-bye.